And again, good morning and welcome to our presentation today with Dr. Joanne Snapp, who's going to be talking to us about creating your school list. This is officially, I guess, application season. Usually starts around April, May, for students who are looking to apply for fall of 2025. So that means next August-ish. Some programs start in July, some start in September. But Dr. Snapp is going to take us through creating the school list and what that looks like. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Joanne.
All right. Thank you so much, Charlie. I love talking about creating your school list because I really believe that it's one of the more strategic things you can do in your application process. I know for a lot of people, the attitude that a lot of people have at the beginning is, I just want to get in somewhere. I just need to get into any school. Like somebody let me in. Um, a lot of people feel that way. And then there's a secondary desire of like, I want to stay in California, or I want to stay in my home state. I want to be close to home. I want to be close to family. And I know that there are these competing desires of like, I just want to get in anywhere. And I also want to be close to home. But here's the thing, at the end of the day, my priority in teaching this to you today is so you can get into a medical school. And I know for people who are applying, allopathic or osteopathic, and this actually applies to dental school and PA school as well. So there's a lot of information here that applies to any of the health professions. But my goal is for you to get into any school, and hopefully more than one school, right? Like, and when we create our school list, what we're trying to do is get as many interviews as we can, because the more interviews that you get, the more power you have to make decisions about what is best for you. So I'm not approaching this as like, oh, I just want you to get into one school, or I'm necessarily prepping you to get into your dream school. This is how to create a school list that's going to help you get as many interviews as you can. And I, of course, respect your happiness, and I want you to be happy and comfortable, which is why, I'm going to teach you how to look things up about schools so that you can make sure that any school on your list is a school that you would be happy going to. As you are starting to make your school list, the very first thing you need to do is get organized. So while you're doing this, I want you to create a Google Sheet. And on your Google Sheet, you're going to start to list schools. And I know there are a few tools out there that help people with school lists. One of them, a really popular one, is MSAR. And I'm going to be honest, like MSAR is nice in that it gives you a long list of schools. It kind of has a lot of information, very centralized. But when it comes to the type of information I'm going to be talking about today, MSAR is only going to take you so far. So you're going to use Google a lot for the research we're talking about. And on your Google Sheet, some of the information I do want you to collect, like letter of rec requirements or any outstanding prereqs, things like that. You could probably find an MSAR and you can track that information using that. But I really want to encourage you to get out of MSAR quickly and start looking at things beyond those types of metrics. The Google Sheet is necessary because it does help you get that information organized. And you want to make sure that if you are applying to, any of the schools you're applying to, you do want to cross-check the requirements, because you don't want to spend money on a school if you know for a fact they require a certain class and you're not taking that class. Under no circumstance are you going to take that class. So make sure you know the requirements of the schools before you proceed. If you're not going to meet the requirements, then don't apply. There are enough schools out there that you don't have to apply to any school that you're not going to meet the requirements. So this is sort of what it would look like. You're going to list your schools and you're going to track all the information. Much of the information I'm going to talk about today is, like I said, not going to be found in MSAR. And I still want you to track that same information on this Excel sheet, because once you start writing your secondaries, which is where the strategy kicks in, you're going to want all this information very centralized. You don't want to have to be searching through websites when you're writing secondaries. You want it all right there so that you can quickly write your secondaries and reference this document. Okay, so we're going to create a couple baseline understandings before we move on. The reason why I think a lot of people use MSAR to create their school list is because they're worried about how their metrics line up with the schools. And I often hear people say, well, my numbers are not even in their 10th percentile, or my numbers are in this percentile, or this or that. First of all, averages are not minimum. So if you're looking at a school's average, the averages are going to be way higher than, I would say, the majority of people that I work with or I see on a daily basis. If you have stats that are in the averages range, fantastic. Like that's great for you. I would just that you're perfectly fine then. If you're a few points above or below the average, you're perfectly fine. Um, but the averages are not guides for whether you should apply to that school unless, you know, how do I put this? Like sometimes we have to use kind of common sense when it comes to metrics. So I'll throw out a hypothetical. If you have like a 502 MCAT, you probably know that there are going to be some schools that are going to be very, very competitive, and a 502 might not be in your best interest to invest in an application to, let's say, Harvard or Yale or Johns Hopkins. Um, and so that's common sense, right? Like you probably wouldn't want to do that. But there are other schools out there where the averages are still really high, let's say a 517 or a 515. And I can tell you there are schools like that that have taken historically 502s or 503s. And so you kind of have to know the trend of the school. You kind of have to know how that school has behaved in the past. And you can sometimes get a feel for that by just talking to students who go to that school. You can also talk to the deans of admission or the deans for diversity and inclusion and get a sense of whether they are encouraging of you or discouraging of you. And if you feel when you're talking to them that they're not being very encouraging of you to apply, well, then that's a pretty good indication that maybe that's not a good fit for you. But you can use MSAR to a degree for that, but it's not always 100% accurate when it comes to your stats. Because sometimes I've seen people with pretty low stats also get into schools that have pretty high averages. Um, Public schools are going to be looking for in-state people. So if you are applying to public out-of-state schools, you're going to want to have higher stats. The out-of-state applicants are going to need to have higher stats to get into out-of-state schools, public schools. However, private schools really don't care where you're from. And so they're going to have a wider range of your stats. So these are the schools where you're going to see lots, numbers from 500 up to 520. They really are more interested in creating a diverse class, as public schools are as well, but they're really interested in having students from a lot of different backgrounds in that school. So they're going to take people from all different backgrounds, regardless of what state you're from. Okay, so for my California applicants who are here today, another thing you need to be aware of is that out-of-state schools often assume that California people don't really want to leave the state of California. And so your burden in applying is to prove to them that you actually would like to go to their school. Now, I know everyone's thinking, well, I really don't. I really want to stay in my home state. Well, I understand that, but you are going to need to get into multiple schools, right? You're going to want to get a lot of interviews. So in order to get a lot of interviews, your job is to convince every single school that you apply to that you are actually really, really excited about going to their school. You have to make yourself want to go to their school. Now, in order to make yourself want to go to their school, you are going to have to do a really good job of writing your secondary in a way that shows them that you're genuinely interested in going to their school. Because I know for a fact that some out-of-state schools screen California students differently because they know you all don't really want to come there. Sometimes they will screen you last. They will screen you later than everybody else after October, because they know that you guys are waiting for your in-state interviews and in-state acceptances. So the way you get invited earlier is to make sure your interest is very, very clear. So this is why creating a school list is so important, because as you do the work I'm about to tell you to do, the better you do at really genuinely falling in love with the schools you're applying to and genuinely writing why it is that you want to be there when you write their secondaries, the more chance you have of standing out amongst the California crowd applying to out-of-state schools. Because there are thousands of people applying from California to out-of-state schools, and they don't know which ones of you guys are interested and which ones are just checking off lists from an MSAR box, right? So they want to know, are you really interested? And that is why creating your school list is strategic, and finding things you like about them is so important. So there are a lot of things we're going to look at when we're creating our school list, and you might look at this and go, oh my gosh, this seems like a lot. Like this is a lot of work. You are absolutely right. This is a lot of work to do this well. If you don't want to do this well, you can quickly, within 15 minutes, create filters on MSAR and generate a school list based on your stats and know nothing about the schools and write generic secondaries and hope for the best. That is one way to do it. A lot of people do it that way. But if you want to be successful in getting a lot of interviews, I would argue that if you put the work in when it comes to picking your schools and really knowing every single school on your list and knowing why you love that school, you are more likely to stand out. So yes, I'm asking you to do a lot of work with this. So big things we're going to look at today. We're going to look at the location, not because of the snow, but we're going to look at who they serve, their clinical rotation sites. We're going to talk about curriculum models. We're going to talk about student organizations, and then other kind of opportunities like tracks and things like that. So, like I said, location is important, but not because I care that you can't, be around cold weather. Um, I think cold weather is part of life. I think if you don't want to be around cold, I'm sorry. It's only 2 years of, 3 years of your life, and then you get to go somewhere else during your fourth year. You get to do rotations, and then soon enough you can apply to residency somewhere else. So it's not forever. And if it means getting into med school or getting into dental school and becoming the thing you want to be, I think you can deal. So the reason why location is important is because the places you go are going to give you access to certain communities. And I know that a lot of you have certain communities or certain goals in your life, and being able to access those communities and resources and opportunities is going to help set you up for your long-term goals. So you want to know if you're training in a suburban, urban, or rural community, because those are the types of opportunities that are going to lead you to your next step. So right now, everyone who's applying should have some idea about where they see themselves in the future. And if you've never really asked yourself that question, that's your first step. Where do you see yourself in 10 or 15 years? Where do you see yourself working? What kind of people do you see yourself serving? Besides practicing clinically, what do you see yourself doing? Do you see yourself working in research? Do you see yourself working in public health? Do you want to be in community medicine? Do you want to be teaching? If you say I want to go into academic medicine, that means you need to have training in an academic, a tertiary facility, right? You need to be in a space where you're going to have mentors who are going to teach you how to go into academic medicine. If you're interested in rural medicine, you clearly need to train in rural or community hospitals where they may be under-resourced, or you may work with people who are underserved. So your goals should dictate where you want to apply, because the way you train during your 4 years is going to set you up for the next thing. Just like when you apply to your health profession program, your past indicates, your goal, your past and your future intersect to tell them why you want to do this thing. It's going to be the same way in 4 years when you apply to residency. They're going to look at what you did during your medical school years, and they're going to say, okay, what do you want to do? And what have you done? And that's why you want to go to our program. So you have to go to a place at medical school where they're going to have the things that are going to set you up to do the things you want to do in the future. So once you get to school, oh, let me back up. There's one more thing I wanted to say about this. So how do you find out these things? I often will open up Google and go just type in like demographic data census and pull up the cities of the school where the schools are located. And I will look at the city demographic information. So I'll give you an example. Burrell College, it's an osteopathic med school in New Mexico. A lot of people I know have applied to that school, so I know this one by heart. So that school is located 45 minutes north of the Mexican border. 60% of the community speaks Spanish. So because you're going to go to med school in a border city, where you will undoubtedly speak Spanish, or at least learn Spanish when you're there, you're going to learn as you're training in that area, as you're just volunteering or doing community service, you're going to be exposed to many of the barriers that community faces when it comes to accessing healthcare or other resources. And so, especially if you want to learn Spanish, if you're living in a community surrounded by Spanish speakers, you are more likely to be able to do that. So if you know, okay, that's one of my goals, is to come out of med school being able to speak medical Spanish, you intentionally choose programs where you know that that's going to happen, so that when you write their application, you can say, I'm choosing, this is what I want to do, and you guys are going to set me up for that. So I would look at the people who are in the town. I would look at the poverty rate. I would look at the racial demographics. I would look at the languages spoken, because it's going to give you a really good idea of who you're going to serve once you get there. And almost every school in the country is going to have you out there doing community service when you're in that school. So knowing ahead of time, what are the organizations in that city that I can be part of? And what are the like community service opportunities that I have? Are they close by, or is it something where I'm gonna have to drive or do a mobile, like a mobile clinic, go into the next city, something like that? Like, where am I going to do these opportunities? Okay. This is a big one. I used to work in a medical school, and the school I worked at was a problem-based learning school. And what that meant was this classroom you see in this picture is an actual classroom that was at the school I was at. I actually have met all of these people in this picture. I've stood in that room many a times. This is what a problem-based learning classroom looks like. And this, I would meet people on interview days who did not even know when they got to the interview day that they were at a problem-based learning school. And that didn't really bode well for them, because they just didn't ask the right questions when they got there. They just seemed like they were kind of clueless. I don't know how they got the interview. But what a problem-based learning school is you are not sitting in lectures, all day, every day. You are given two clinical cases, and you have pre-reading, so you read chapters of the book ahead of time. And then you basically show up like this, and you are creating learning objectives. So you're coming up with the questions that you need to know for your problem, your case. So you're going to have the patient labs, the environment, everything about the patient. So you're going to come up with learning objectives for that patient. And then you'll go out and you'll research them. You'll look at medical journals, you'll read more textbooks, you'll talk to each other, you'll go to lectures about that particular disease. And then you come back together and you discuss it, and you come up with a diagnosis and a treatment plan. And you usually do that for two cases every week. And the education is supplemented with lectures that are centered around the disease you're studying for that week. So you're not just listening to biochemistry lectures or microbiology lectures. You're only listening to things related to the disease. And then they usually integrate the anatomy lectures and the anatomy dissections with the disease you're studying. So everything is kind of connected. You're learning about things, you're reading about it, you're discussing it. And so problem-based learning is you're learning the science around a particular problem, which is usually a pathology. Same thing with case-based learning. It's the exact same concept, but you learn medicine early on from like year one, first 2 years, you're doing this over and over and over. So you can imagine the type of attributes and skills you're gaining from this. You're learning to identify the right questions to ask. You're learning how to find information quickly. You're learning how to assess that information, what's useful, what's not useful, and you're learning to teach each other. You're communicating with your groups. You have to be a really good team player. You have to be really professional. So if you have to show up to a group of 8 to talk about science, there's a really good chance you are going to be prepared when you show up to that group. You're not going to wait to the last minute and cram for a test. This is going to be a high accountability, a very professional environment, versus a school where you're sitting in the classroom for 2 years, you take multiple choice exams, you can kind of watch the lectures at home, you show up, you regurgitate the information on the test. And there's a lot of research that you can read about it yourself that shows that learning like this is way better for people in terms of long-term retention than just memorizing facts. So people who go to PBL schools tend to do better on the boards simply because they actually remember the concepts and they're able to recall that information much better. So that's just my little plug for problem-based learning. But the point is you should know if you're applying to a PBL school versus a traditional school, because when you write the secondaries, there are certain qualities that they would be looking for in their candidates. And also you just want to know if you're going to one of these schools. Like, if you have no idea if you're applying to a problem-based learning school and they're asking you about a time where you had to work independently on something on your secondary, you won't know that that's why they're asking you that, and you won't answer the question appropriately. You need to tie the answer back to the problem-based learning. That's how you show them, hey, I know about you. I like you enough that I've researched you, and I really want to be at this school. So that's a big thing, knowing the type of curriculum. Some schools are mostly problem-based. Some schools are mostly or only traditional, the 2+2 model. And then there are some schools that have a very integrated or hybrid approach, meaning you're doing both PBL and traditional lecture learning. And you can figure out to what degree they're doing that by just looking at their curriculum page on their website. The other thing you want to make note of when you're picking out your schools is the opportunity for interprofessional education. And what that means is when you're at that school, do you have the chance to learn with other health profession students? So are there medical, dental, PA, nursing, pharmacy, and do they let those students talk to each other? So in a problem-based learning environment, ideally you'd have people from all those different professions sitting around the table discussing the clinical case together. And that gives you a chance to practice interacting with other health professions and learning how they would consider the same problem. And then the other thing you want to be aware of are opportunity for early clinical experiences. So again, that 2+2 model used to be that you were in the classroom for 2 years, you didn't touch a patient, and then you go to clinic and you touch patients your third year for the first time, and that's where you train in your last 2 years. And there are a lot of med schools who have completely flipped that on its head and now said, actually, we're going to train people for 4 years. And so they put people in clinical training sites from day one, and they give them 4 years of hands-on clinical training to help them be better prepared when they graduate and go out and touch people for real. So if that's something that you're like, yeah, I'd like that, that would make sense, then look for schools. You can actually Google this, right? Just Google early clinical experiences, medical schools. And any school that has early clinical experiences in their website are going to pop right up to the top. Same thing with problem-based learning or case-based learning. Just Google that phrase and with medical school, and they're all going to come up, and then you can just start clicking through them and reading about them. Um, so clinical experiences, this is that typical last, 2 years of your education, but primarily the third year. So everybody has to have the same training in the third year of medical or dental, or all the schools actually. But where are you getting that training? That is not standardized because there are some schools that have you training in large private tertiary facilities where you're getting access to leaders across the country who are world renowned in their areas, and then there are people who have you train in small county hospitals, or community hospitals, like I said, where there are very under resourced and there are not a lot of practitioners available. And so I want you to imagine the difference between training at a large public or private institution where um, famous and wealthy people go to get their health care, versus where, in a rural community where they're very short staffed and they're desperate for help. What would your clinical experience be like at either of these rotations? And you might think, oh, well, I think it sounds amazing. I'd much rather be at the world renowned hospital. But I want you to think about that for a second. And I'm not saying one is better than the other, it's just different. And so I want you to think about the differences and what your training would look like. If you go to a place where everyone is extremely well off, let's say, and I have heard through the years that certain locations there are patients where they say, I don't want any students touching me, don't let any students near me, I only want to work with the best doctors in your hospital. And in that case, the students don't ever get to go in those rooms, right? Like the students are kind of kept away from certain patients because the patients are saying, I don't want anybody touching me who isn't the best doctor out here. And then if you go other places where there are hardly any doctors and they need people helping, they're going to be like, hey, come here, come watch this. Let me show you how to do this. They're going to have you in the room. They're going to be teaching you how to do it because they need help, right? As soon as you learn how to do something, they can put you to work and then you can do it with them. And so it is possible that if you're in a more under resourced or underserved community training, you might get more hands-on care or practice, I should say, because there are fewer people there who are kind of in that mixed training at the same time, versus at a big hospital where there are a lot of people doing their rotations. You have residents, you have fourth years, you have third years. You're kind of going to be competing for the little bit of space you have to be able to do things. So again, not one is not better than the other. If you say, well, I want to be, the number one neurosurgeon in the country, in my career, then it would make sense that you are in a space where you're training around, the best neurosurgeons in the country. That's what you would want to do. If your goal is to serve in a community medicine setting, in a rural community or an underserved community, then it would make sense for you to train in a space where you're going to get to learn and see how that works out. So if you, yeah, so if you are in your first 2 years at a lot of schools, um, most schools that have an affiliated hospital lets their students, they get a name badge for their hospital and they get to go in and they can shadow doctors, they get to go in and kind of do basically be part of the hospital, the health system if they're owned by that hospital. Some schools, though, some medical schools and dental schools, they actually have their clinical rotation sites not attached to their school. They're not anywhere near them. The students actually have to go pretty far away to get into those clinical training sites. And so not all schools are equal in that regard either. Some students can't just walk into a hospital and shadow doctors at their leisure. They're going to be having to travel and set that up and do all of that on their own. So knowing where your clinical rotation sites are physically located, whether it is across the street from the school, attached to the building, or literally miles away, hours away. I have heard some schools send their students out of state for their 3rd year. That happens a little bit more with DO schools, but it is important for you to know where you're doing your clinical rotation sites because you may be thinking, oh, well, I'm going to go to Arizona and do my, my medical school, but then you end up in Florida for, your 3rd year and you weren't planning on going to Florida. Um, so that's something that you probably want to make sure of before you apply, that you're okay with that, because you can't be mad at them if that happens to you, if if you knew that up front. It's a good way to narrow schools down. Now you may be thinking, I actually would love to travel. I think it'd be really fun to see different parts of the country and train in different areas during my 4 years. And if that sounds exciting to you and you kind of welcome that adventure, then then cool. That wouldn't matter to you. I actually had someone I was talking to the other day who was deciding between two schools, and one of the schools kept students nearby for their rotations and one sent them away. And the factor was that she had a dog, and she's like, I don't know what I'm going to do with my dog when I go away. So she ended up deciding on the school that didn't send her away because she had a dog. And that's a very legitimate thing, right? Like that's part of her life right now, and that matters to her. So that's how she chose her school, was based on that factor. Okay, another thing that I find that a lot of students don't know about is that schools actually have tracks. They're kind of like majors if you think about it. So when you go to school, any kind of school, they usually you have the exact same curriculum. Everyone has to learn the same science in the first 2 years. But now schools have implemented these kind of like separate tracks that students can choose. Some schools you can elect into them, and some of them they force you to choose a track. And if they force you to choose a track, they usually do that during the secondary process. They'll ask you which track you're choosing, and they'll make you write why you're choosing that track. But they can be tracks in all kinds of things. The most common ones I see are community medicine, urban medicine, rural medicine, um, public health, leadership, research. So if you choose a track, academic medicine is another track. If you end up choosing a track, you basically go off and take electives in that area, and it's kind of pipelining you into a particular career. It's like a pathway into that career. And it gives you extra training and mentorship to do those things. And so that's pretty cool because now you have another thing you can look at for schools. If you know for a fact you want to do, let's say, community medicine, then you can pick out schools that have community medicine tracks and boom, there's your school list, right? Like you already have, you know that when you go to those schools, you're already going to be in a space where they can support your career goals. And you can find these by Googling like whatever you care about. I'll give you an example, one that's actually not a track, but something people care about. I have a lot of people I've met who care a lot about addiction medicine. And there's no track for addiction medicine, but here's a way you can use something you really care about to pick a school list. So if you Google addiction medicine medical school, what you're going to find pop up are going to be people at the school who do research in addiction medicine, or you're going to find addiction medicine clinics or addiction medicine institutes. And if you find at that particular school that there is an addiction medicine something, when you're a student at that school, there's a good chance you're going to be able to go to that. If there's an institute or research, somebody doing work in that area at that place, even though they don't have a particular track, you can say when you apply to that school that working under Dr. John Smith, in the blah, blah, blah Research Institute, I'm really excited to be able to pursue my interest in addiction medicine by participating in blah, 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 whatever they're doing, outreach, harm reduction, research. And so the more specific you are in finding things at that school that really are attractive to you professionally, the more likely it is they're going to say, okay, this person has really done their work and has really, understood why they're applying to us. Versus some of the nonsensical stuff I've read over the years where the people will say, going to your school will help me become the esteemed physician I've always dreamed of becoming. Like, that's absolute nonsense. Like, doesn't say anything at all. It's just saying, hey, I'm going to become a doctor if I go to your school. Yeah, you'd be a doctor wherever school you go to, right? So you gotta kind of level up a little bit. You're going to have to say specifically why it is that school is going to help you. I would tell you should definitely know the tracks before you apply. Um, okay. So how do you find all of this stuff? Like I said, Googling is probably your first step. I would say start with Google and search for these phrases. Search um, problem-based learning medical school, harm reduction medical school, uh, public health track medical school. Pick phrases and start clicking. And then as you click, start clicking, keep going, read more, go to the Student Life website, go to YouTube, go to the website, look at the photos, look at Facebook. If you can talk to people there, that's even better. If you can go to fairs or if you have schools visiting your school, go to those events. Like every chance you get, talk to people because you start to put pieces together about institutions. And then as you start to realize what you're looking for, then when you do talk to a school, you can ask more targeted questions. You could say, okay, I'm really looking for schools that have some kind of coursework in policy and public health. Do you offer anything like that? And then you can get more targeted information out of the schools if you know what you're looking for. I always encourage people to look for the schools, look at the school's photos. Look, sometimes the websites though are not truly accurate. They use a lot of stock photos, but like go to the Facebook page and look at the students' pictures and just make sure that if you go to that school, that's a place where you're going to feel included and welcome. Like look at just get the vibe of the school. If you can't really get the vibe of the school through the pictures, then just talk to people. Ask people who are similar to you how they feel at that school and see if there's anything there that you want to be aware of before you decide to apply there. This is what most schools' websites look like. They have these kinds of tabs along the top. And so some things here I just want to point out. Looking at the mental health services, I've been in person to probably like 20 different med schools, and they all vary on the type of mental health services that they offer. I've been to some schools where they have an entire free counseling service and it's all anonymous, it's completely free. People can walk in anytime and get mental health services. And then I've been to some schools and they're like, here's our student wellness lounge, and there's like a bouncy ball and some like a waterfall, and they're like, okay, they go in there if they're stressed. I'm like, that's not mental health services, right? Like that's just nice, but that's not what students need. Like if you're having a crisis, you need a professional person to help you. So looking at the degree of mental health services available to people, I would use that as criteria if that's important to you. I would also use the amount of support, the career advising available to you. Just like you have Charlie and Ashley and what I do, you have people at your school who should be preparing you for residency. They should be advising you, career advising you. And if they don't have anyone like that, that's kind of a big deal. You want to know that, and you want to know who those people are. And then what else is on here that you probably want to look at? I would just check out the news. I would Google the school, see what's going on. Are they opening new buildings? Are they moving? Things that matter to you. If they're building a brand new building right when you're going to school and you're going to be in a transition period, if you're deciding between two schools, that might matter. Okay. Oh, and no researchers. So if you're really into research and you have a particular area of interest, whether it's humanities or social science or bench work or clinical research, know what they do there, know the institutes that they have, and then find a researcher doing something you're interested in. And you can actually say, like, I'd be really excited to work under blah, 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 blah. When you're there doing this thing, it again, it shows that you're connected. Here are some organizations I found when I was just doing a quick search for different types of clubs. You can actually reference student organizations in your app for another reason why you really like the school. And schools have student orgs in every kind of area. Um, when you say you're really interested in a particular student organization, it also gives them a chance to learn a little bit more about you and what your interests are. So, for example, if a school asks in a secondary, what do you do for fun? You can say, well, I really love to sing, and I see that you guys have doctor's notes, an a cappella group. I can't wait to join that group. So you just make little connections back to the school wherever you can. That shows them that, hey, I took the effort to look into that already. So here are some things that we talked about that I think everybody should know before or while they're picking out schools. I want you to know if, the type of city you're in. I usually start by asking people, do you want to live in a big city or do you want to live in a more suburban or rural situation? I don't know that there are a lot of schools that are actually located in rural communities, with the exception of like CHSU. But most of the time they're in more suburban areas. They may be right outside of a big city, but of course there are a lot of schools that are right in the heart of a city. And there are people who are like, oh yeah, that sounds amazing. But then have you ever had to carry your groceries up 5 flights of stairs? Or have you ever had to take the train home at 11 o'clock at night? If you're not really into public transportation or, carrying your groceries, then you might not want to live in a big city. If you really like pulling your car into a Target parking lot, then applying to schools in big cities might not be your thing. And I think it's really important to consider that because you are going to live there for, multiple years. Now I know I'm contradicting myself because I said the snow doesn't matter, but I think there are certain things like snow only happens, 4 or 5 times a year. Carrying your groceries every week is going to happen every day, every week for 3 years. So there's a big difference in between the cold and your day-to-day life. Um, Again, we talked about who is your advisor, I think. And also, I didn't say this, but when you interact with the school, sometimes you will pick up on a certain attitude of the school. So if you go to a presentation and you're listening to the financial aid person talk, or you're listening to anybody talk really, if you keep getting the same kind of hostile or negative vibe, I want you to remember that these are the people who run the school. These are the people you have to go to and ask questions when you're having a problem. If the people who interact with you at, any kind of session or open house are not really pleasant to be around, I just want you to put that in the back of your mind, because that's they put the best people out there, right, for you to meet on those days. So I would take that into consideration, because that kind of is, yeah, that is going to be your school if you go there. A lot of students that I've talked to really care about this, and so I put this on here if you've never heard of this or thought about it. But the difference between a school that uses in-house exams versus NBME exams. So NBME is like a training tool for schools to help people prepare for the USMLE. And what they do, schools use NBME questions and they integrate NBME questions into their regular assessments. And then what it does is it gives the school like a dashboard on each student that tells the school how well prepared the student is for the board, so that the school can keep tabs on how people are doing throughout their first 2 years of medical school and be able to kind of intervene if there's like a problem early on. So if a student is not doing well in their MBME questions, then the school say, oh, we gotta intervene and like give them some supplemental instruction so that they can get up to speed. So some schools do that. They use NBME questions. And then some schools don't. They use only in-house questions. And what that means is that their faculty write their own exam questions. They're not using any type of USMLE data. They're not doing anything like that. And those schools will usually tell you they're very confident that their in-house questions have prepared their students well for the boards. But I have found that some applicants care a lot about this issue. If you are in the house and you're the party where you're like, no, I want to be taking board questions the whole time, then you just need to ask that question. Are you using those NBME questions? You are going to find though that you may have schools picked out that you really like that don't do that. And you can't use that as a criteria, right? But that's just something, again, to be aware of. In the event that they ask you why you like their school, that could be a factor that you describe as a reason for really liking their school. Also, a lot of schools will provide their students with third-party resources for board prep. Some schools will give you resources right off the bat, like from day one, you get access to like they buy subscriptions to I don't know, Sketchy or UWorld or something where you can start prepping for your boards. And then some schools don't do that. They either give you something only in the 4 to 6 weeks they give you to prepare, or they don't give you anything at all. And I've seen a huge spectrum in that. So if you find out what third party they use, when do you get access to that, and how long do you have to prepare? Those are good questions to ask as well. We talked about location in terms of cars, but if you drive, great, not really an issue. If you don't drive, you might want to find out if you need a car. There are schools where you 100% have to drive. So I've also noticed that that has been an issue in the past with some people. And then, choosing schools, we've talked about out of state schools. There are very few schools that I would say, don't really consider, but there are some that if you know if you know that they have a system set up that excludes people from your state, then why would you waste the money applying there when there are so many other schools that you can give $100 to and actually be considered? So, and I don't know, Charlie, if you agree with me on this, but like University of Washington and Oregon have a system. I know this for a fact. I don't know if he agrees whether you shouldn't apply or not, but they have a system built where they give you certain number of points for having connections to the state. And some of those are, you've lived in the state, your parents went to school in the state, you were born in the state, you have relatives in the state, just any kind of connection. And if you don't have, they'll ask you these questions. And if you don't have those points or those connections, they don't interview you. They simply screen you out. And so I've had people who've had no connections to Oregon still apply, thinking, oh, I'll give it a shot. When I've had the dean of the admissions at Oregon straight up tell me to my face, Joanne, don't have your students apply here because we are just straight up screening them out. So I actually stopped having people apply there, a few years ago because of that conversation. Make sure if you are applying to those schools, you check the point system and just see if you have enough points to even qualify. Uh,
Totally agree. Totally agree.
yeah. Okay.
And just say, on top of that, sometimes I don't think that gets sorted out because students are just, as you said earlier, looking at the MSAR and more GPA and MCAT score and not really sort of the mission or focus of the school. And then the second thing is that some schools do a better job. I know the University of Washington School of Medicine or College of Medicine says, School of Medicine, we do not accept California residents. So you want to heed that. Where Texas, some of those schools maybe don't as much, but when you do a little bit of reading and sifting on their website, you start to get the feeling of this is really more for Texas applicants. Hence, they have their own application system.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And it's not, they make it pretty, they create quite a barrier or a burden for you to apply to Texas. Some people go ahead and do it anyway, but my thought is, if you don't have family there, if you've never stepped foot in the state, and they've actually made it clear they don't want you to apply because they made it more challenging and more expensive, then take the money you would have spent on that extra application and just apply to more AMCAS schools. If you have the money to apply to Texas, then apply to more schools in, outside of Texas, and give yourself more chances that way. Unless you really do want to be in Texas. If that is true, then you're going to have to do a lot of research and really articulate well how it is you're going to bring value to those communities. Same thing for the southern states, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana. Now, I will say I have had students get into Tulane. I've had students get interviews at LSU. But if you're looking at other state schools down there, it's gonna be tough. UAB does accept out of state, and that's the only Alabama school I'm aware of that accepts out of state. Um, Mississippi, I'm not aware of anybody. South Carolina, Kentucky, a handful of Tennessee, maybe. Those kinds of states, like they're going to be very preferential for their in-state. And same with California. Honestly, California is very preferential for in-state. Most states are, but there are a handful of state schools that do recruit outside of their state. So you need to know what those are, and there are way fewer state schools letting people in from out of state than there are not. And private schools are honestly, if you're looking out of state, I would just stick with private. That's your easiest way to guarantee that you're going to be okay. And I know some of you might be thinking, yeah, but private schools are so expensive. Private schools also have the most money. So if you get an acceptance at a private school and you can't pay the tuition, there is a very good chance they're going to supplement that with scholarships. And they have need based, a lot of schools have need based aid. So I wouldn't worry about that yet. What you're trying to do is just get as many interviews as you can. Once you have a lot of interviews and you get acceptances, then you have more power to negotiate your financial aid package. If you only have one acceptance, you're not competitive. You only have one acceptance. So you have to go where you go and you get what you get, right? You can't complain. But if you have multiple acceptances, then you can start talking to them and talking about, well, this costs this and this costs this. And is there any way you can match this? And you can have those conversations with schools once you are in that position to do that. But you got to get yourself in that position. And the way to do that is to apply strategically. So, we talked about that. I would encourage you to go to every open house, every info session, just everything you can go to get yourself out in front of people. I know we're going to be doing some stuff at UCR this summer where we're going to have some admissions folks come to your campus and you'll get a chance to do some face-to-face advocating for yourself there. But any other opportunity you have to get in front of people, get out there and talk to people. That is the best way to make connections. And you can actually refer back to those conversations in your secondaries. You can say, I met so and so at a fair where we talked about, this, and this about your school. And that really inspired me to want to go there. And so, yeah, those things really matter in this process. So I'm going to stop there and see if anybody has any questions about anything. I talked a lot. So you might need to process that. And if you do have more questions, I know you can meet with Charlie and Ashley during appointments or at drop-ins.
One of the things that I'll just reiterate on that Joanne just said is that if you have the opportunity to go to any open houses or whether they're in person or virtual, that's really helpful for a couple of reasons. Just there's a lot of information that's on a school's website, and that's really helpful because they've decided that it's important information or it wouldn't be there. Um, but I also think that it's helpful to hear, but like you're here this morning or watching this recording to be able to put the pieces together. So how everything sticks. Um, Joanne said earlier, that feeling is really important. So you want to make sure you have a good feeling about the school, or maybe it's not the right school for you. And then also, I think last, it just helps you to have the correct information. I know sometimes students will look at MSAR data, they'll come and see us, and then they'll watch a YouTube or a Reddit, they'll go right to Reddit. And so we're just trying to help you to like follow the vetted resources, the school website, the school like events that they have, whether it's virtual, in person, or school ambassadors. Those are the things to get the feeling, and then use that with the data to then decide is that the right school for you. So that you feel good about, oh, if I were to interview here and I were to be accepted, it's legitimately a school that I would give strong consideration for.
Yeah. We have two. I got a private message, and then Jasmine's question is pretty similar. How do we know if it's a high yield school for California applicants? So one way that I would suggest, and maybe Charlie and Ashley can help with this, is look at historical data. So look at where your last year's applicants got accepted. I mean, I can rattle off a whole lot of schools that, and Charlie could too, about, who take California applicants. But if you look at where, and obviously past data doesn't predict your chances. So just because, 10 or 15 UCR students got into Loyola last year doesn't mean Loyola is going to accept you, but it does give you a really good idea of behavior, right? So I would maybe, when you go into one of your professional advising appointments, maybe ask about where did last year's students end up going, and look at how many people went to what schools so that you can see, okay, here are some schools that I know are friendly. Now, I will say, don't use that 100%, because sometimes I've had people who pick some schools and I'm like, I don't know about this school. Like, I've never heard of Northeastern Ohio. And then next thing you know, two people got interviews there. And I'm like, okay, now I know that's a good school for California people. I would have never thought of that. So find schools that are a good fit for you. And if you really think they're a good fit, even if you never heard of anyone applying there, if they say they're out of state friendly, and if you really don't know, honestly, just email the school, ask the school. say, hey, I'm from California. Can you give me an idea of how many people in your last class came from California? Or are you really welcoming of California applicants? They will be honest with you. And if they seem welcoming, then I would say go for it, even if you don't know anyone who's applied there, because maybe there aren't a lot of people applying, which would make it easier for you then, right? Because you bring that geographic diversity. But MSAR does help with that a little bit. You can see the out-of-state acceptance rates, and I think there's a little map in there. You can hover over the states, and it tells you how many people from each state were at their school. Um, so that is helpful for that purpose.
We also, in our office, collect application data annually of where students apply. So we can always advise in that regard. And we've developed partnerships across not just the region and the state, but nationally. We have, let's say annually, a bulk of our students are applying to, and I'm just throwing this out anecdotally, without going in and looking at the numbers right now, but Western University of Health Sciences in Pomona is our #1 feeder program because they have almost all health professions programs there. We also have some students going to Davis every year to their School of Medicine. Um, in terms of other areas, Davis, Marshall B. Ketchum, PA program. We have students going to Marshall B. Ketchum for optometry, um, dentistry. It tends to be Western and USC, with a few students going to UCLA and USC. Pharmacy, Loma Linda, Western, um, AGI, which is in Claremont. So fairly local schools, but we also have students that are at Michigan State, University of Chicago, School of Medicine, there's across the country. So we have a student at Indiana University, which is one of those schools that was really, really tough to get into as an out-of-state student. Again, this is an anecdote, but this student wanted to go back, wanted to go to Indiana. He was married. His wife's family was from Indiana. He wanted to go there and applied as an out-of-state applicant, did not even get an interview. He moved there. He was actually an engineering major. He got his teaching credential to be a substitute teacher, and then applied to Indiana U as a pre-med or medical applicant, and he's there now. He's actually a 4th year. So that was somebody who just he really needed to be at a certain place, which Joanne talked about, and that was worth him waiting 2 years to apply because he really wanted to be there to have that family support and also lower cost of living and lower tuition.
Yeah. I've met people who are married and they want to stay in a particular region, and they kind of say like, I'd be willing to apply 2 or 3 times like you're describing just to stay there. And that's a very personal decision. Trying to assess that for yourself, I think the question is, if you want to limit yourself to where you want to apply, you have to ask yourself, if you get to the end of the cycle and you don't get in, are you going to feel worse going nowhere or going somewhere you hadn't initially planned on going? And if the answer is like, I'll feel worse going nowhere, then you should apply broadly.
Yeah, absolutely. Other questions for Joanne? We have 3 minutes left, but if you do have any, since you are here in real time, this is your opportunity to maybe ask one final question. All right. Well, Joanne, any parting words?
Nope, I would say spend a lot of time on this, get started early so that you can make sure that you have a really good school list. And Ashley and Charlie, if you meet with any of these folks, I want you to test them. When you look at their school list, I want you to say, why are you picking this school? And they should be able to tell you off the top of their head why they love that school. And if they can't do that, then make them go back and do the work.
Great. Well, thank you, Joanne. And again, please thank Joanne for her time. We will post this session to our YouTube channel within the next week. So if you need to go back and watch it, you may. You can also refer any of your friends who are looking to build their school list or really just need some help thinking this out. Feel free to refer them to our YouTube channel.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. Have a good day, everybody.